I am Barbara Corrado Pope. I was the first director of Women's Studies. I believe I came here in 1975 or 1976. Um, I worked down in the basement of PLC, which is like the dungeon of the University of Oregon for anyone who's been there. And I remember clearly there were a bunch of us we felt were hanging on by our fingernails. There was ethnic studies, which had black, yellow, and orange flags. There was environmental studies, which had ferns. And then there was the lavender women's studies. And I used to come to work and call it the floor of ephemeral studies because I did not think we would survive. But we did. We survived and we thrived, mostly because there was a student demand for what we were doing. I had the fun of being the first woman to do a few things. One is I was the first woman to win this sort of citizenship award of promoting citizenship in the University of Oregon. I won a teaching award, and I was the first director of the Honors College in an interim between one women's studies career and another women's studies career. And since I retired, I have written 3 historical novels, and I have just about editing my 4th. What did I research? I was in French history, and my dissertation, which regrettably, my fault, never turned into a book, but into a number of articles, was called Mothers and Daughters in Early 19th Century Paris. And doing this dissertation made me part of a generation of people who really created women's history. I've explained that how it happened was because of Sputnik, because the Russians were the first to put a satellite into the air. There was a lot of investment in higher education, and lo and behold, there were a lot more women in higher education, a lot more people of color in higher education, saying, where are we? This is not who the Sputnik people expected to fund, I'm sure. But we began asking this question, and as a generation working together, we did create our fields, and my field was women's history. And the story I always like to tell my students was I was at the University of New Mexico in 1972 during their first women's history course. There was very little material, so I titled the course From the Stone Age to the Present so that I could, have some content. And at the same time, there was a place in Pittsburgh called KNOW, K-N-O-W Incorporated, where I would send my syllabi, put in a few dollars, and they would, in return, I would get everyone else's syllabi that was concerned with the same course. And that's how we built. We built by having conferences together. We built by caucusing at conferences. One caucus, the women's historian got together and said, look, 1920s, there were a lot of books on women's history, and after that it died out because the first movement died out. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. We're going to get into the textbooks. So there was a strategy and a generation. Well, I got a few grants, and the particular grant that I did with CSWS was the sort of next step of teaching about women in women's history and women's studies classes, and that is to integrate the work of ethnic studies, racial, women scholars into the curriculum as a whole. And I called it a university for everyone. And we had a convocation at which we had seminars for students of color so that they could talk their grievances. And Julia Lesage, a member of the center, made a film of them. I worked with faculty. We invited in scholars. And that was one of the proudest achievements that I had here. And that was through the center and with the center, especially helping me with the finances. I'm not a numbers person, so it was great to have that help. And also they funded some of my work, including a documentary called Processione, which is about a Sicilian Easter procession. And a lot of my work was done on Catholicism, women in Catholicism, gender in Catholicism. And the other work was sort of straight women's history. The relationship between women's studies and CSWS was not always easy. There were rumors about the money coming in, and there was a faction within the sociology department that wanted to make sure that the money would not go to women's studies. Because they wanted to go simply to research and not to teaching. Now, there was a good rationale for that, which is that the state should pay for teaching or the university should pay for teaching. But this was a continual cause of friction. So my relationship with the center was to participate, but not always feel comfortable with some of the decisions that were made. We're living in very hard times for feminists and for women. But I would think the best vision for the university people to follow and to think about is to connect with the community. I was very lucky. The only reason that women's studies survived is because of the community. A community of scholars all over the United States, but also the community within Eugene. And there was a very thriving women's community. And I feel that, I feel like a curmudgeon, but I'll say it, that women's studies has become in some ways too solipsistic. The fact that here we are in the year 2024 in the United States of America, and there are some people trying to bring suit that pregnant women should not be able to cross state boundaries. I mean, there are major issues. And it's not that the other issues aren't important, but there's a sense in which I think there's been a loss of connection with the very simple things. Maybe I was too simple. I taught something very simple. I taught a change in perspective, that once you know about how women and race figure into every society, it's like you turn a kaleidoscope and you can't go back. You'll never lose that vision. And I think going back to a little bit of the simplicity would be important for both the center and for academic women's studies.